Thank you. After my dad died a while back, my brother gave me a box of pictures to go through. And there were photos from vacations of old, and there were these. Throwbacks from the 70s. That is me on the left. Huge collar, groovy shirt, red fringy vest. And on the right, my parents had some kind of polyester house party of sort. But these aren't the pictures that impacted me most. Surprisingly, these did. They were taken 25 years ago, and you can see my dad. He's in a couple of the shots. You also see white, black, male, female police officers, all dismissive of their apparent differences, unified, laughing, and discussing issues. These pictures goaded my conscience, because honestly, I have trouble thinking about an activity of mine, or many activities of mine, or of anybody I know, that's characterized by this level of collaborative solidarity, this level of investment of time, this wide a circle of friendship, wider than just family and closest friends. We've turned inward a bit. I think we are more likely to say, "Not my problem," than we once were. And self-indulgence makes us unhappy, yet we seem to have shallowed a bit. Solidarity, on the other hand, makes us happy. It takes us outside of ourselves, it fills our activity with meaning, and it counters two of the most prevalent tendencies of our time, which are isolation and powerlessness. Solidarity is a virtue. It's a virtue rooted in truth and justice, and the equal dignity of us all. We retain our dignity even independent of our crimes. Certainly independent of our wealth, our income, our age, our sex, our race, our size, our status. Solidarity requires a commitment to the most marginalized and vulnerable across the world. We are all equal. You know, from a secular viewpoint, we're all human beings. From a religious viewpoint, we're all children of God. And if, in fact, solidarity has waned, it's less an opportunity for criticism and more an opportunity for leadership. Because if we lead through solidarity, people will be attracted to the unity we offer. And if we lead through solidarity, people will be attracted to the expansion of human possibility, which is the very opposite of saying, "Not my problem." That brings me to my topic, which is inflation and energy transition, both in dire need of solidarity. The average single mother in this country makes $49,200 a year. Some of us may know people who spend $49,000 a month. She doesn't have that kind of flexibility. She doesn't have the kind of peace of mind that comes with the ability of spending $49,000 a month. In fact, if she blows a tire, she'll probably replace it with a retread, and even that she can't afford because her $49,000 in income is already spoken for. If she has a medical surprise, she'll have the procedure if she must, but she has no idea how to pay for it. And after she has the procedure, then come the calls from the bill collectors. Calls that alienate, calls that isolate, calls that upset her and her family. For the rest of this talk, let's let the single mother be the tangible face of the common good. Let's not do anything that causes her to have to choose between paying her electric bill, feeding her family, and feeding herself. That takes me to what I'm going to cover next, which is the mess in Europe, if you haven't heard about it. Bad energy transition policies have made a mess in Europe. I'm also going to talk about what's called net zero roadmaps, which are the plans to get to zero greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm going to suggest a few ideas to incorporate solidarity into those roadmaps for two reasons. One, let's be thoughtful of our single mother. Two, let's try to make energy transition a success. And by baking in solidarity, I think we have a much better chance of doing that. So first, the mess. Power prices in the United Kingdom recently reached 700% of the last decade's average, and energy prices have soared across Europe because reliable sources of energy were removed and unreliable sources of energy were inserted. Specifically, windy wind and natural gas sourced from Russia were inserted. The correlation between natural gas, power prices, and carbon prices has spiraled upwards. And that's a harbinger of things to come worldwide if policies aren't changed. It used to be that coal to gas substitution would tamp down power prices. But with this highly correlated ascent, European consumers are now stuck with enormous power bills. And European governments are scrambling to provide subsidies of some kind to repair the social compact they broke with rash policies, policies that were long on sentiment and very short on prudence. The issue remains unresolved. Winter is here. Energy prices in Europe are skyrocketing. Natural gas prices are high. Fertilizer prices, as a result, are high. Now food prices are high, and hunger will spread. The problem and the mistake that is still being made is a framing of the issue in either-or terms. Either total renewables today or total apocalypse tomorrow, and it's wrong. It's a much better framing to look at it as both and. Both prudent energy transition and no harm done to our single mother. At the time European policies were decided upon, better answers were knowable and weren't exactly, hidden. If prudence had replaced fear, if virtue had replaced virtue signaling, if both and had replaced either or, and if solidarity had replaced impatience, things would be much better in Europe. Reliability is one problem. Cost is another. A recent widely cited article pegged the cost of worldwide energy transition at $100 to $150 trillion. That's a lot. And the echo chamber of media, CEOs, and politicians have called for it to be spent at a blistering pace in less than 30 years by 2050. That's a problem because it's going to be highly inflationary. Because the investors of the trillions want a return of and on their money, and they want their money back in a reasonable period of time. Because the cost of energy is enmeshed in almost every good and service that we purchase, and because new energy, logically, is more costly up front than already paid for energy. Let's look at North America. Of the $100 to $150 trillion, $21 trillion is slated to be spent in North America. About half of that should be spent, according to the roadmaps, in the power industry, and the other half across other industries. Most net zero roadmaps don't answer the question, who will pay for this? They instead suggest the need for, quote, public sector intervention, long-dated project finance structures, and high-risk equity capital. Those non-answers essentially mean two things: higher prices or higher taxes, which may be fine if disclosed up front, democratically chosen, and justly applied. A sneak attack is wrong. But let's look, this is a complicated slide, but let's simply model the $21 trillion in North America if it is raised either completely in all taxes or completely in private investment. What does it mean to the average North American household? I'm sorry, the average US household. $21 trillion, trust me on the math, $21 trillion, 590 million people in North America, 2.5 people per household in the US, means each household is on the hook for another $88,000 in taxes. These net zero architects are in a hurry, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt that they don't want to raise the taxes in 1 or 2 years, they want to raise them in 5. $88,000 spread over 5 years is $17,600. So if taxes, every US household's bill for energy transition rapidly is $17,600. If private investment, trust me when I say if private investment, the prices of things have to go up. Why? The investors are going to provide the capital but want a return of and on the capital over a reasonable period of time. The companies are not going to take on extra debt and extra equity unless they think they're going to have more cash flow with which to service those obligations. More revenues and more cash flow means higher prices. So 21 trillion, the math is almost over, 21 trillion in private investment. Let's say those investors want a weighted average cost of capital for both the debt and the equity of 7%. They'd like the money back in 20 to 25 years. Basic mortgage math, same amount of people in North America, same people per household in the US, $16,600 per household in extra costs. So if taxes, $17,600, if extra costs by way of private investment, $16,600. Let's round down to $15,000 even. Now we come back to our single mother. She makes $49,000, she spends $49,000. Now she has a bill, an extra bill, for $15,000 for energy transition. We know she's a darn good mother and she's going to take care of her kids at all costs. So she'll probably reflexively just try to eat less. $50 a day of eating less means she can't eat for 300 days out of every year. It doesn't work. Rapid energy transition in Europe engineered energy scarcity, skyrocketing prices, and misery. The same will happen here if we make the same mistake. Despite that, financiers have called for rapid energy transition and hope to raise the green dollars with which to finance energy transition. In fact, the world's most prominent financiers very recently, and I quote, called energy transition a race requiring radical economic overhaul. $15,000 to our single mother is radical economic overhaul. I just don't know that it's the kind we want to make. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with financiers. I'm a financier. The issue is that, as proposed, working class living and eating and electrical expenses is the source of return to high net worth investors. There's got to be a layer of solidarity, of fairness, of justice inserted. Otherwise, rapid energy transition becomes a regressive transfer of wealth from the poor to the wealthy, from labor to capital. I've got 3 ideas for the insertion of solidarity into this equation. First, subsidies, from those who can afford it to those who can't. Second, both and. By the way, both and is almost always a better answer than either or. Both and, both fossil fuels and renewables need to be baked into the equation to maintain energy reliability and reduce the cost per household. And finally, pacing. Is it possible we could not make this a race and not ruin people's lives to save people's lives? Can we spread it out a little bit to minimize the annual household impact? Let's take a look at that. But first, subsidies. Subsidies. The Department of Energy came out 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, and said energy already burdens poor households 3 times as much as it burdens affluent households. In fact, 25 million American households report scrimping on food and medicine to pay energy costs. We cannot now put the cost, the huge cost of energy transition on their shoulders. Tax big oil. I know carbon taxes sound like a great answer. The problem with carbon taxes is it's a regressive tax. The poor end up paying it anyway. And it's a sin tax. Think about alcohol or cigarette taxes. With carbon taxes, taxing big oil will do exactly what you want. Big oil will become big wind, big solar, and big carbon capture. And then the tax base will have shrunken. So to pay the subsidies, we need a broader tax base than simply a sin tax, tax big oil. And then, of course, if we do put in subsidies, out of fairness, we will say those below a certain income level shall not be tagged with the cost of energy transition. And we should. Let's say we say it's $200,000 and below doesn't have to pay the $15,000 or is reimbursed the $15,000. 90% of the people in this country make less than $200,000. So now we've got 10% paying not $15,000 per household, but $150,000 per household. So subsidies are necessary, but they're not a sufficient condition for success, which is why we have to look at both and pacing. Both and. First off, fossil fuels, and in particular natural gas, are largely already producing, which means the cost is behind us. If, in fact, we can bake in depreciated sources of energy into this mix, the cost goes down. Plus, there's the reliability issue. Natural gas comes out of a natural gas well with the predictability of air coming out of a balloon. You spread it across thousands and thousands of wells, you've got the benefit of diversity. Now you've got reliable supply, predictable demand, hanging out with each other, and no problem. Finally, pacing. I'm not a climate scientist, but contrary to the apocalypse tomorrow narrative, it appears as if there may be some wiggle room in terms of how fast we spend this stuff. And I'm going to go, the next chart, ignore the top for a moment. Just look at the bottom, which is the quote. I'm going to try to remember the quote. The UN and the IPCC says there is a near linear relationship between cumulative CO2 emissions and global surface warming trends. Cumulative. What does that mean? It means that what happens next year in terms of emissions, or in 10 years or in 20 years, is absolutely relevant, but it's not exclusively relevant. It's diluted by the history of emissions that's already happened. How long is that? That's 170 years. So maybe that buys us some room for spacing the spending out. Fortunately, the IPCC did some work, which is on the graph above the quote, to help us out with that. These are 5 emissions scenarios. Ignore the top 3. They're bad. Lots of emissions, and in fact, that 0 line is the zero emissions line. As you can see, the top 3 never get to 0, so we're going to ignore those. But the bottom 2 are the best, and of course the bottom most is the very best. And they are labeled by the IPCC very low emissions, which is the bottom one, and low emissions, which is the next one. Very low emissions crosses the 0 line in 2050. You hear about net zero 2050 all the time. Low emissions crosses the 0 line in 2075, 2080. That's 25 more years. Is low emissions good enough? And I know every one of us who's been helicopter parented doesn't want to accept good enough. We want to go for the best. But there's something at risk here. So the IPCC did some work for us. And the question is, what's the difference in warming between these 2 cases if the IPCC's projections are right? All right, so you see 3 sections on this graph. These are 3 time periods, by 2040, by 2060, by 2100. And the circled data is the difference in projected warming between very low emissions and low emissions. So by 2040, the IPCC says there's a 0 degree Celsius difference between low emissions and very low emissions. By 2060, there's a 0.1 degree Celsius difference. And by 2100, there's a 0.4 degree Celsius difference. I'm not a climate scientist, I said it once. I think 0.4 degrees Celsius sounds small, but I'm not sure. But if you read the SPM that was put out by the IPCC last fall, 0.4 degrees Celsius is within the margin of error for the very low emissions case, for the best case. So it does seem as if we're talking about relatively small differences in terms of the impact on the climate. Something to consider. And to put it most simplistically, if we were to just stretch the 21 trillion out pro rata through 2075 or 2080, the average per household cost would go down by over 70%. Maybe there's something to work with there. Then subsidies would be doable. So, in summary, the philosopher George Santayana said, when experience is not retained, infancy is perpetual. I liked it too. What's going on in Europe right now isn't even past. We don't have the luxury of forgetting it. I guess we can look away, but not to process it would be infantile. And I know we live in a relativistic culture that says the ends justify the means. That's wrong. As is the often heard statement, don't let a crisis go to waste. Both the goal has to be good and the path to get there has to be good for the enterprise to be good and not to be corrupt. And human dignity needs to be the measure of our success. In this case, the insertion of solidarity into energy transition is not only right, it's practical, because consider the alternative. If we were to say instead, it's a race, we got to do it, we'll figure it out later, tag the working class, a yellow vest moment is guaranteed. Protests are guaranteed, at which point I think our opinion poll-governed political class might crater and energy transition might fail. Another philosopher said, a wise man is not cowed by knowledge, he is guided by it. We have the data, we have the projections, we have Europe. Let's do energy transition well so that our single mother can pay her bills, her electric bill, feed her family, and feed herself both before and after net zero. Thank you.